Against the London system, in the previous video, I went through this specific variation after c5 in e3, knight c6 and c3. The queen is allowed to go to b6, attacking the b2 pawn, threatening to win the pawn uh, with the threat of the rook. So in the previous video, I went through b3 um, as a move for white to try and protect this. And now I'm going to go through what happens after queen b3. So black has to play c4 and attack the queen. So the queen has to move back or swap. In the next video, I'm going to go through what happens after queen swaps. Queen. So now the queen can go back to c2. Basically, it's the only square that makes sense to go to in order to protect the pawn and save the rook and so on. So uh, if the queen were to move somewhere else, right, okay, a4 or d1, then the b2 pawn would be taken safely. a3 will be just insane, because after queen a3, then there's an attack on the queen with the bishop, and the pawn attacks the bishop, so black is going to win material. So after queen goes to c2, now black plays this move, pawn to e5. Now this pawn can be taken in two different ways. Well, the pawn has to be taken because if bishop were to go back for some reason, then, well, that's worse for white. The threat is bishop f5, which happens regardless. So whether the pawn takes or the bishop takes the pawn in e5, bishop f5 is going to come anyway. Now, bishop f5 is attacking the queen, so the queen will have to move away, and then black will continue. But it's important for the queen not to take the bishop, because then the b2 pawn will be taken and the rook is trapped, and there's no compensation for white. So after the bishop goes to f5, the queen will have to move away, still protecting this pawn. So let's say, for example, queen to c1. After this move, now the pawn can be taken, and now there's two options. One of them is to take either with the e1 or with the c1. But taking with the c pawn falls into this very silly strategy that everyone knows. The knight is going to b4 and then threatening this, also threatening d3 if the bishop takes the knight, and the bishop takes back, and black is completely dominating. So for example, knight here, and let's say knight to a3 to put extra protection to the c2 square. Knight d3 and bishop takes, bishop takes. Now white will have to be able to castle, so knight f3 is no longer possible, because otherwise it will not be able to castle. So knight e2, and now bishop to b4. Black's development is very harmonious, and well, this cannot be stopped. The king will have to move. So let's say after king f1, for example, black plays c3. Black is completely winning here. The idea with this move is to destroy everything around the queen side. And well, if white pushes the pawn, then this is a very strong passed pawn. If white were to take the pawn, then black can just take the knight. This comes to a check, king takes, and then queen a6. So your piece attacking the knight, and black is winning a piece. So going back to the previous situation, here in the variation where the bishop is going back to g3, pawn takes pawn, and earlier we tried c takes, and now if this pawn takes, then again bishop f5, same thing. The queen can't take the bishop unless he wants to give up the rook, and after queen to c3, now black castles long side. The threat is to give a check and start putting pressure on the opponent's king. So what does white do here? Well, white will have to castle in order to find some safety. So let's say either knight f3, bishop e2, or I don't know, any other normal moves. Let's say bishop e2, now rook e8, simply putting pressure. After, for example, knight f3, then bishop d3 simply wins, because there's two pieces attacking this bishop and it cannot be defended further without losing a lot of material for white. A move like knight e5, for example, just falls into a very simple tactic. Bishop takes for free. The bishop's free. If the king takes, then the knight is pinned, and black will move a pawn and win the knight. So another way to try and stop all of this, after the long castle, white can try, for example, knight to e2, and there's a bishop in e5. So after the long castle, knight to e2. So this position is actually worse than the previous one. Rook e8 comes again, and now white is just paralyzed. The knight can't move to a3 because from a3 it's just doing nothing. How does white defend all of this? Well, before looking at knight a3, white can try like something like h4. The idea is to get the bishop back, uh, and allow some development like g3, bishop, and then castle maybe. Black just continues with normal moves, knight f6, and the plan here is simple. The knight will reach eventually the square e4 with an attack on the bishop, trying to destroy the king side. And after the bishop moves, black will have a sacrifice available. So let's say now it's white to move. Well, the queen can't move, not really that far. Queen d2 will come with the threat of the knight here, and it's just a really, really bad game. So let's say, for example, knight goes here, then the queen will have to move to still protect the bishop and defend the pawn structure. Then again, the pawn will fall. If the queen moves on the light square diagonal, then this is a free bishop, as the knight will guard the bishop. So after this move, the bishop moving, now there's a sacrifice, which is basically knight to c5. Now the knight is threatening this tremendous fork in d3, and after being taken, bishop takes, black is completely winning. So that means that what could he have done at this point after knight f6, knight threatening e4? Then there's two ways to stop it: either knight d2 or pawn to f3. After knight d2, black continues with g6, and the idea here is simple. Afterwards, it's going to be bishop h6. This knight is pinned by the rook. This knight will be pinned by the bishop, and white's pieces are completely paralyzed. After that move, the goal is to play rook e6 and then rook here. White's possible maneuver like bishop h2 to allow development of the other bishop is just completely silly, because then this bishop will be locked, and also there will be too much pressure on this knight. Maybe another attempt could have been f3 instead of so after knight f6, white can try f3 to stop the knight from reaching two very strong squares. But the problem here, basically, white has created more weaknesses, more empty squares around this king. Now bishop d3 comes, there's increasing pressure on the knight, and so what does white do here? First of all, the black's plan is to play g6 and then bishop h6, attacking the queen. And if the queen takes the bishop, then finally this pawn in b2 would fall with the rook as well, and so on. So white's bishop is completely blocked, the light square bishop. Well, if white tries to develop the knight, for example, then again the threat remains the same: g6, bishop h6, pinning the knight, rook e6, and then the other rook comes, and white will never be able to move anything around here and eventually lose material. If instead white were to play something different like queen d2, still protecting the b2 pawn, then black will be adding pressure in the exact same way. g6, bishop here, the queen can't take it because of the pawn in b2, and then after bishop h6, and knight h5 and knight f4, eventually after the bishop moves, there will be too much pressure on this knight. Again, rook e6, rook e8, and so on. So back at the position after e5, I'm gonna go through first of all what happens if the bishop takes. Now again, bishop f5 is the move, and after queen c1, the knight can take the bishop, pawn takes back, and now black plays f6. Now the reason is, well, if the pawn takes, then the knight can develop, and black is absolutely safe here, also because there is literally no white pieces developed, and so there's absolutely no worries into developing the f pawn, because black king is anyway 2 steps away from castling after knight f6, and after f6 black should probably play knight f3. That makes sense the most in order to speed up development. Let's say, for example, a move like f4. If white really wants to keep the center, that is just completely silly, because after bishop c5, then there's no defense of this pawn, unless white wants to move the king somewhere, but I think this is getting a bit ridiculous. So after knight f3, black takes the pawn. That's the whole point of moving the f pawn, so you can give up a side pawn for a central one. And after knight to e5, black's development continues with bishop to c5, then knight f6 and castle. So what does white play here? Well, again, knight to a3. This kind of move would be just silly, because the knight isn't going anywhere afterwards, unless he wants to play knight c2, knight d4. It's a very slow maneuver, and black is just going to be fully developed by then. So after bishop e2, so the white can castle, knight f6, castle, and castle. Black's position is much better. White needs to develop the knight now, but after knight d2, there's already a problem here. There's a simple tactic, which is basically bishop takes pawn, pinning the knight. Well, if pawn takes back, then simply queen takes with check, comes with an attack on this knight. So that's winning. There's also another threat. After bishop e3, the pawn doesn't have to take the bishop, so white can try knight to c4 to attack the queen and the bishop. Again, bishop takes here, and now the knight is hanging, so if the queen takes, then the knight is free. So knight takes back, rook a to e8. Both rooks are on open files. The queen's putting more pressure on f2. Knight's ready to jump. And well, what does white play here? After something like this, everything wins here. Like even bishop g4, the pawn is pinned, putting more pressure on the bishop. If bishop takes, then knight takes. Just too much pressure on the opponent's king. So a few of the things I should have mentioned before. After bishop takes pawn, uh, the pawn doesn't have to take the bishop. White can play knight e to c4, and now black just takes the knight. Well, if knight were to take the queen, then bishop takes queen, and after knight takes rook, black simply plays bishop f4, cutting off this diagonal, so the knight will be taken next move, and black is winning. Also possible is knight to g4, putting already an attack on this pawn. Bishop takes, then bishop takes, and now knight f3 seems like it can kind of hold things together, but then bishop takes, and after pawn takes, queen g6 check, king h1, and moves at queen d3. There's no defense after this. If rook e3, which is the only desperate move here, just a bunch of swaps, and it's game over. Simply because black's rook is active and white's rook is not, so black will just be winning one pawn after another. Black just has to improve the position of its king, so after the only move to protect the pawn, rook here, rook f2, and after rook d1, white has to get the rook active. He can't just start pushing these pawns, so that's silly. King f7, rook takes, for example. All of this is just potential moves. None of this is going to happen. None of this is any theory, but it's just that this king isn't playing. It's not able to reach this rank. The black's king is better. Rook's protecting this pawn, so black doesn't have to worry about forks. After e4 and king e7, black is just completely safe. Moving back to the previous situation, the queen has just moved back to c2, and black played e5, bishop takes, and now bishop f5, Sometimes, I mean, white doesn't have to go to c1. You can go to d2 with the queen. Things don't change much because knight takes, bishop comes, of course, pawn takes, and now knight to e7. The idea is simple. You want to go to c6 and then target this pawn and use the dark well bishop through fianchetto to go and take e5 and control more squares in the center. So after knight e7 and something like knight f3, again the f4 pawn to support this pawn is a bad move. Knight c6. Important to remember that the pawn in d5 cannot be taken because of b2. So after bishop e2 and the usual idea of g6, now black cannot play bishop g7 yet because the pawn in d5 is under attack, and this time going to b2 the queen will be useless because of knight d2. So after bishop e6 and normal moves like a4, a6 to gain more space, white can try something I should have mentioned before, the knight a3 development with c2 and knight d4. After that, bishop g7 and knight c2, knight can finally take the pawn back, and now after knight d4 castle, it seems like a completely normal game, but the position here is better for black. What does white do here? White cannot, well, white has, black has the bishop pair. If white takes the bishop in e6, then the pawn will take back, and black has an excellent pawns chains in the center, and the backwards pawn of e6 cannot be threatened by any major piece like a rook or a queen, because it's going to take ages for the file to open, and a move like e4 cannot be played immediately without black just winning it for free and allowing development of the rook to an open file before white. So white's pieces are paralyzed. The bishop isn't able to go anywhere. This knight can't just go anywhere that makes sense. In g5 will just be attacked again, and then we'll have to go back. There's no possibility of moving the knight again unless white just wants to waste a lot of tempos. And I don't know, b4 is the only square available, but it can just be stopped with a5. So the white knight will have to go all the way back. White can try something like rook b1 and then open the file for the rook. It's the only thing left to do to try and gain some space. After this move though, the weakness of the white pawns on the queen side becomes clear. After rook a to c8, this bishop is taking the whole board, cutting the whole board in half, and the rook is preparing to attack c3. So after rook a to c8 and b3, then a bunch of swaps, knight takes, bishop takes here, and well, taking with the c pawn will allow black to pass pawn, so taking with this pawn, black just plays this move anyway. The rook can't take the pawn immediately, so black has successfully produced a pass pawn. Black's plan is simple, it's just lift up the rook to c4 with an attack, so with a tempo, and then double up the rooks and hit the weakest pawns of the opponent.